"This contract ends in exactly 48 hours," Marcus said, his voice cold as winter steel. We were standing in his penthouse, the New York skyline glittering behind him like a constellation of broken promises. I looked down at the legal document in my hands. Our fake engagement agreement, signed 3 months ago when I was desperate and he was strategic. "After the charity gala tomorrow night, you'll receive your final payment, and we'll never see each other again." He turned away, but I saw it, the slight tremor in his hand, the way his breath caught. For 3 months, I played the role of his adoring fiancée. I'd learned his coffee order, memorized his childhood stories, held his hand through panic attacks he'd never admit to having. And somewhere in performance, the lines had blurred. "What if I don't want the money?" I whispered. Marcus froze. Outside, thunder rumbled. Inside, my phone buzzed, a message from his business rival. "I know everything. Expose him tomorrow, or I will." Time was running out, and I was about to make the biggest gamble of my life. If you've ever loved someone you weren't supposed to, if you've ever had to choose between protecting yourself or protecting someone else's heart, then you understand where I'm standing right now. Before we go any further into this story, I'd be so grateful if you'd take just a moment to like this video and subscribe. It truly means a world to me, and it helps me keep sharing these stories with you. And if you know someone who believes in second chances, in love that breaks all the rules, please share this with them. Thank you, truly. My hands were still shaking as I slipped my phone back into my pocket. Richard Castellan's threat burning in my mind like acid. "I know everything. Expose him tomorrow or I will." The words felt like a countdown timer ticking in my chest. I looked around Marcus's study, this private sanctuary I'd only been allowed into twice before, and suddenly everything looked different. The mahogany shelves lined with business journals and leather-bound books. The crystal tumbler on his desk, still holding an inch of amber whiskey. The way the city lights filtered through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the Persian rug beneath my feet. But it was the photograph in my hand that undid me. 6 weeks ago at the Thompson Foundation Gala, Marcus's hand resting on my waist, protective and warm, my head tilted toward his shoulder, laughing at something he'd whispered in my ear. We looked so natural together, so real. I remember that night, how he kept his hand on the small of my back, even when no one was watching, how his thumb had traced absent circles against the silk of my dress. I shouldn't have opened that drawer. I'd been looking for a pen to sign the final contract amendment when I found them, not just his photograph, but others, dozens of them, hidden away like secrets. Us at the Metropolitan Museum benefit, walking through Central Park on a Sunday morning that was supposed to be our day off from pretending. Me falling asleep on his couch during a late-night strategy session, my face peaceful in a way I never managed while awake. He'd kept them all. And beneath the photographs, letters. Pages and pages in Marcus's precise handwriting, dated but never sent. "Dear Emma," I started reading one and had to stop, my vision blurring with tears. Words about how my laugh had become the only genuine sound in his carefully constructed world. How watching me paint in his penthouse on quiet Saturday afternoons had taught him what peace felt like. How terrified he was that I'd walk away when the contract ended and take all the light with me. There was something else in that drawer, too. A small velvet box I didn't dare open because I knew what it meant. This wasn't the props ring we'd use for appearances. The tasteful diamond selected by his assistant for maximum photographic impact. This was something he'd chosen himself. What I didn't know then was that Marcus had been protecting a secret far bigger than our fake engagement, one that would change everything. The real reason he needed a fiancée wasn't just about convincing his board directors. He was stable and trustworthy. There was something darker underneath, something connected to his past that Richard Castellan had discovered and was weaponizing against us both. I heard footsteps in the hallway outside the study. Marcus, returning from his phone call with his attorney. In 12 hours, this would all be over. The contract would expire after tomorrow night's charity gala. I'd receive my $100,000, enough to finally pay off my mother's medical debts and start fresh. We'd shake hands like business partners and walk away from each other forever. That was the agreement. Except I'd broken the cardinal rule. I'd fallen in love with Marcus Thornfield. And now I had to decide whether to save him or save myself, knowing I couldn't do both. 3 months earlier, I was a completely different person. Or maybe I was exactly the same person, just more desperate, more exhausted, more willing to compromise the principles I thought I'd never bend. I was 29 years old, working 3 jobs, and drowning in $47,000 of medical debt from my mother's cancer treatment. She'd passed away 8 months before, and the bills kept coming like cruel reminders that even death doesn't settle accounts in America. I worked mornings at the Riverside Gallery in Chelsea, a pristine white space where people paid more for a single painting than I made in 6 months. I worked afternoons waitressing at a bistro in Midtown, carrying overpriced salads to women who pushed the lettuce around their plates and complained about the dressing. And I worked nights doing freelance graphic design on a laptop that crashed more often than it saved my work, designing logos for startups that would probably fail before they ever paid me. Sleep was something I did in 4-hour intervals. Dreams were luxuries I couldn't afford. My studio apartment in Brooklyn was the size of most people's closets, and I'd stopped buying groceries that required actual cooking because I didn't have the energy. Instant ramen, protein bars, black coffee that tasted like burnt rubber but kept me conscious. I tell you this not for pity, but so you understand why I said yes. Why, when Marcus Thornfield's assistant approached me at the gallery on that Tuesday afternoon in late September, I didn't immediately laugh in her face and walk away. Her name was Patricia Chun, and she wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent. She waited until the gallery was empty, except for me and old Mr. Hendricks, who came every Tuesday to stare at the Rothko in the back corner and cry quietly about his late wife. Patricia watched me help Mr. Hendricks to a bench, bring him tissues, sit with him until the tears stopped and he could smile again. She watched me treat him with the dignity and tenderness he deserved, not rushing him, not making him feel ashamed of his grief. After Mr. Hendricks left, Patricia approached me. "Miss Mitchell, I represent someone who has an unusual business proposition for you." Her voice was crisp, professional, revealing nothing. I thought she was going to try to sell me something, insurance or a pyramid scheme or whatever else people peddled to the visibly desperate. But then she named a figure, $100,000, for 3 months of work. I actually laughed. What kind of work requires that kind of money? I asked, already imagining the worst. Drugs, something illegal, something that would land me in prison and make my mother turn in her grave. Patricia didn't smile. The kind that requires exceptional discretion, flawless execution, and the ability to convince some of the wealthiest, most perceptive people in New York that you're genuinely in love with someone you've never met. That's when she told me about Marcus Thornfield, 34 years old, self-made technology CEO. Thornfield Innovations was going public in 3 months, but as board directors, old money conservatives who believed in family values and traditional stability had concerns about his bachelor status. They wanted a family man at the helm, someone trustworthy, someone who had roots and commitments and reasons to think long-term. Marcus needed a fiancée, not a real one, a contractual one. 3 months of public appearances, charity galas, board dinners, carefully orchestrated photographs for society pages and business journals. I would be coached on his preferences, his history, his mannerisms. I would wear clothes his stylist selected. I would smile at the right moments and say the scripted things and play the role of the woman who'd capture the heart of New York's most eligible bachelor. And at the end of 3 months, we would have a quiet, dignified breakup. Mutual decision. Remain friends. No hard feelings. I'd walk away with $100,000, and Marcus would have satisfied his board's concerns long enough to take his company public and cement his position. Why me, I asked. I'm nobody. I'm a broke artist who can barely keep herself afloat. Why would anyone believe Marcus Thornfield would choose me? Patricia smiled for the first time. That's exactly why you. Marcus saw you with Mr. Hendricks today. He was here looking at a painting for his office. He watched how you treated that elderly man, the genuine warmth and patience you showed him. Marcus's words were, "She has authentic kindness. That's not something you can teach or fake. That's what I need." I should have said no. I should have recognized all the warning signs, the red flags waving frantically in my peripheral vision. But when you're drowning and someone throws you a rope, you don't interrogate the rope's intentions. You grab it. So I said yes. I'd meet with Marcus Thornfield and hear his proposal in detail. The meeting happened 2 days later in his penthouse office, 90 stories above Manhattan, in a building that seemed designed to make ordinary humans feel insignificant. Marcus was waiting in a conference room that had windows instead of walls. The entire city spread out below us like a kingdom he'd conquered through sheer force of will. He was handsome in that sharp, controlled way that made you think of expensive watches and German engineering. Dark hair cut precisely. Ice blue eyes that seemed to calculate profit margins, even when looking at your face. A suit that fit like it had been sewn directly onto his body. But it was his stillness that struck me most. He didn't fidget or gesture or fill silence with unnecessary words. He simply existed with absolute certainty in his right to occupy space. "Miss Mitchell," he said, extending his hand. His grip was firm, brief, professional. "Thank you for considering this arrangement. Please sit. We have much to discuss." His voice was deep, measured, revealing nothing of what he thought or felt. "This is purely transactional. No feelings, no complications. You'll be compensated generously for your time and discretion. I expect flawless performance, absolute professionalism, and complete commitment to maintaining the illusion. When the 3 months end, we part ways. Clean. Simple. Understood?" I looked at this man, this stranger who was offering me salvation wrapped in deception, and I made the biggest gamble of my life. "I understood," I said, and I signed the contract that would change everything. The first week was a masterclass in artifice. Marcus assigned me a team like I was a product being prepared for market launch. There was Patricia, who managed my schedule with military precision. There was Vivian, a stylist who took one look at my thrift store wardrobe and actually winced before filling my closet with clothes that cost more than my annual income. There was Julian, a media consultant who taught me how to smile for cameras, how to angle my body toward Marcus in photographs, how to touch his arm with casual affection that looked spontaneous, but was carefully calculated for maximum visual impact. And there was Marcus himself, sitting across from me in his penthouse every evening, teaching me the details of a life I was supposed to share with him. His favorite coffee was Ethiopian single origin, black, no sugar. He was allergic to shellfish, but would never mention it at dinner parties, because he didn't want to inconvenience hosts. He'd grown up in Connecticut, in a house he no longer owned. His parents had died in a car accident when he was 19, and his uncle had embezzled a family fortune, leaving Marcus with nothing but debt and determination. He'd built Thornfield Innovations from absolutely nothing, sleeping in his office for the first 2 years, eating ramen and protein bars, exactly like I was doing now. That detail caught in my throat when he mentioned it, this unexpected common ground between us. He asked about my life, too, not because he cared, but because he needed the information for consistency. My mother's name was Sarah. She'd taught high school literature and loved Edith Wharton novels. My father had left when I was 6, and I barely remembered him except for the smell of cigarette smoke and the sound of doors slamming. I'd studied fine arts at a state university on scholarship, graduated with honors and debt, and spent the last 7 years trying to make a living doing what I loved while the world reminded me repeatedly that art doesn't pay medical bills. Marcus listened to all of this with that same calculated stillness, taking notes on his tablet, like I was a brief he needed to memorize for court. But sometimes, just sometimes, I catch something flicker across his face. A tightening around his eyes when I mentioned my mother's death. A softness in his expression when I talked about teaching art to kids at a community center on weekends. The only job I did purely because it mattered. The training wasn't just intellectual. We had to learn each other physically, too. The muscle memory of intimacy. How to hold hands in a way that looked natural. How to stand close enough that cameras captured connection, but not so close it felt invasive. How his hand would rest on the small of my back when we walked into rooms together. How I'd straighten his tie before important meetings. A gesture of affection that would seem second nature to observers. That was harder than memorizing facts. Because when Marcus's hand touched my waist for the first time during one of our practice sessions, I felt electricity run through my entire nervous system. When I reached up to adjust his collar and my fingers brushed against his neck, I saw his breath catch, saw something unguarded flash across his face before he locked it down again. "We're not method actors," he said quietly, stepping back. "We don't need to feel it. We just need to look like we do." Our first public appearance was the Anderson Charity Gala. 2 weeks into our arrangement, I wore a navy gown that Vivian had selected, something elegant and understated that whispered old money rather than screaming new wealth. Marcus picked me up at my apartment, and when I opened the door, I saw him actually hesitate for half a second, his eyes traveling over me before he caught himself. "You look appropriate," he said, which I learned was Marcus speak for compliments he didn't want to give. The gala was terrifying. Hundreds of people, all of them wealthier and more powerful than I'd ever be, all of them watching us with predatory curiosity. New York society loved fresh gossip, and Marcus Thornfield's sudden engagement was prime feeding material. But Marcus never left my side. His hand stayed on my waist, steady and warm, anchoring me when I felt like I might float away from nervousness. He introduced me to board members and investors and people whose names I recognized from Forbes covers, and every introduction came with a small detail about me. "Emma's an artist. She does the most remarkable work with light and shadow. You should see her studio sometime." He was selling the illusion, I told myself, playing his role flawlessly. But when we were alone for a moment on the terrace, the city glittering around us and music drifting through the open doors, Marcus looked at me with something that seemed almost like wonder. "You're doing well," he said softly. "Better than I expected." I almost believed it myself. That's when I started to understand how dangerous this arrangement truly was. Because standing there in the moonlight with Marcus Thornfield's hand still resting on my waist, I realized something terrifying. I wasn't acting anymore. The lines between performance and reality were blurring faster than I could track, and I had no idea how to stop it. "Never blur the lines," Marcus had said during our first meeting. "This ends when the contract ends." But neither of us knew how to follow that rule when every touch, every glance, every quiet moment between us felt more real than anything else in our carefully constructed lives. 6 weeks into our arrangement, everything changed. We were attending a charity event at Memorial Children's Hospital, one of those glittering affairs where wealthy people wrote enormous checks and felt virtuous while champagne flowed and string quartets played in marble hallways. For me, hospitals were places of trauma. My mother had died in a place that smelled exactly like this, antiseptic and floor polish, masking the scent of suffering underneath. I'd told Marcus this during one of our evening briefings, a clinical exchange of information he needed to know in case I had a visible reaction in public. What I hadn't told him was that Marcus himself had donated $500,000 anonymously to the hospital's cancer research ward. I only discovered this when the hospital director pulled us aside and thanked him privately, tears in her eyes, explaining how his contribution was funding a clinical trial that might save dozens of children's lives. Marcus looked uncomfortable with her gratitude, deflecting and redirecting as quickly as possible, but I saw something in his face I'd never seen before. Genuine care, real emotion breaking through that controlled exterior he wore like armor. The tour took us through the pediatric oncology ward. Children with bald heads and 4 poles and smiles that broke my heart into fragments. A little girl, maybe 7 years old, showed me the picture she'd drawn of a garden full of flowers she'd never been well enough to plant. She had my mother's eyes, that same gentle hopefulness, even when the world was cruel. I held that drawing in my hands and felt something crack open inside my chest. The tears came before I could stop them, hot and devastating, and suddenly I couldn't breathe. The walls were closing in, and I was back in that other hospital room, watching my mother take her last breath while machines beat their useless protests. Marcus's hand found mine instantly, not the careful, photogenic touch we practiced. Something urgent and real. He pulled me away from the crowd, down a quiet hallway, into an empty consultation room. He didn't ask if I was okay. He just held my hand and waited while I fell apart, his thumb tracing circles against my palm exactly like he'd done at that gala 6 weeks ago, the gesture that had felt too intimate even then. When I could finally speak, the words tumbled out. My mother's diagnosis. The 2 years of treatment that gave us hope before taking away. The hospital bills that kept coming even after she was gone, like the world was determined to punish me for loving someone I couldn't save. How guilty I felt taking his money for this arrangement when my mother had taught me never to lie, never to compromise my integrity, never pretend to be something I wasn't. Marcus listened to all of it. Then he did something that changed everything between us. He told me about his parents' death, the car accident on a winter highway when he was 19, how his uncle had systematically embezzled a family fortune while Marcus was grieving, leaving him with nothing, how he'd built Thornfield Innovations from absolute zero because he couldn't trust anyone else not to take everything from him again, how he'd learned to be cold and controlled because vulnerability was something he couldn't afford. We sat in that consultation room for an hour, missing the rest of the gala, forgetting about cameras and performances and the roles we were supposed to play. Just two broken people sharing their wounds in the fluorescent light of a hospital hallway. When we finally stood to leave, Marcus looked at me with something raw and unguarded in those ice-blue eyes. "Emma," he started to say, then stopped himself. His hand lifted toward my face, hesitated in the air between us. For a breathless moment, I thought he might kiss me. Then he stepped back. "We can't," he said quietly. "The contract. This has to stay professional." But his voice betrayed him, rough with something that sounded like regret. We walked back to the gala in silence, his hand no longer touching mine, the distance between us suddenly feeling like miles instead of inches. That night, alone in my apartment, I finally admitted the truth I'd been avoiding for weeks. I was in love with Marcus Thornfield, and it was going to destroy me. Richard Castellan entered our lives like a serpent sliding into Eden. I first saw him at the Metropolitan Museum benefit, 7 weeks into our arrangement. He was tall, silver-haired, handsome in that practiced way that comes from expensive personal trainers and even more expensive dermatologists. He smiled with too many teeth and watched Marcus with the focused intensity of a predator circling wounded prey. Marcus. His voice carried across the gallery, warm and familiar in a way that made my stomach clench. "And this must be the famous Emma. I've heard so much about you." His handshake lasted a fraction too long, his eyes traveling over me in a way that felt like an appraisal. "You've done well for yourself," he said to Marcus, though his tone suggested the opposite. "Lovely girl. Quite the departure from your usual type." I learned later that Richard Castellan had been Marcus's friend once, back when they were both building their empires from nothing. They'd started as allies, sharing office space and investment strategies, and dreams of changing the world through technology. But friendship corroded when competition entered the equation. Richard's company, Castellan Technologies, had been pursuing a hostile takeover of Thornfield Innovations for 2 years. He wanted Marcus's patents, the proprietary algorithms that made Thornfield worth billions. He wanted to absorb everything Marcus had built and add it to his own empire like a trophy. The takeover attempt had failed because Marcus's board remained loyal. But Richard was patient. He watched and waited and looked for weaknesses he could exploit. And apparently, he'd found one. Me. 2 days after the museum benefit, Marcus received the first message. I was in his penthouse going over our schedule when his phone buzzed and his entire body went rigid. His face drained to color as he read whatever was on that screen. "What's wrong?" I asked. He didn't answer immediately, just stared at his phone like it contained a death sentence. "Richard knows," he finally said, his voice flat and cold in a way I'd never heard before. "He knows about the contract, about the arrangement. He has proof. A private investigator had been following us for weeks, documenting everything. The staged photographs, the rehearsed conversations, Patricia's payments to my account. Every piece of evidence needed to prove our engagement was fraudulent. The message was simple. Sell me Thornfield Innovations for $200 million, a fraction of its actual value, or I expose you to the board and the world. You have 1 week to decide." Marcus stood at his windows, back turned to me, shoulders tight with tension. "I won't surrender my company," he said quietly. "It's all I have. It's everything I built from nothing. I'd rather lose it fighting than hand it to him like a coward." But 3 days later, I overheard Marcus on the phone with his attorney. "She's just an employee," he said, his voice sharp and dismissive. "Nothing more. A business arrangement that's ending soon anyway." When he hung up and turned around, he saw me standing in the doorway. The look on his face told me He knew exactly what I'd heard. I left without saying a word. Just an employee. Nothing more. The words echoed in my head all the way back to my apartment, every syllable like a knife between my ribs. I'd been so stupid, falling in love with a man who saw me as a transaction, a line item in his business ledger. What I didn't know was that Marcus had been lying to his attorney, trying to protect me from Richard's investigation. But I wouldn't learn that truth until it was almost too late. 1 week before the contract ended, Marcus's grandmother arrived unannounced at his penthouse. I was there reviewing final details for Charity Gala when Patricia ushered in a tiny woman with silver hair and eyes exactly like Marcus's, sharp and calculating but somehow warmer. "This must be Emma," she said before anyone could make introductions. "Come here, child. Let me look at you." Her name was Catherine Thornfield, and she was dying. Pancreatic cancer. Stage 4, though you wouldn't know it from the steel in her spine or the firm grip of her handshake. She'd been estranged from Marcus since his parents' death, kept away by the uncle who'd stolen everything. But she tracked him down after seeing our engagement announcement in the society pages. "I wanted to meet the woman who made my grandson smile again," she said. "I haven't seen that look on his face since he was a boy." Marcus tried to maintain his usual control, offering her tea and small talk. But Catherine saw through everything. She always had. After an hour of pleasantries, she asked to speak with me privately. Marcus hesitated, clearly uncomfortable, but his grandmother's look brooked no argument. He left us alone in the library, and Catherine took my hand in hers. "That boy hasn't smiled like that since his parents died," she said quietly. "Whatever you two are doing, whatever this arrangement is, you've given him something precious. Don't waste it." I started to protest, to explain that it was just business, just a contract, but she squeezed my hand. "I'm 87 years old, and I'm dying. Don't insult me with lies. I see how you look at him. I see how he looks at you when he thinks no one's watching. That's not pretend, sweet girl. That's the real thing." Later, she confronted Marcus directly. I heard them talking through the closed study door. "She loves you, you fool," Catherine said. "And unless I'm completely blind, you love her too." Marcus's response was barely audible. "I hired her, grandmother. It's all fake. A business arrangement." Catherine's laugh was sharp. "Love doesn't care how it starts, Marcus. Only how it ends. Don't let pride and fear cheat you out of happiness the way they cheated me." 3 days later, Catherine Thornfield died peacefully in her sleep at the hotel where she'd been staying. The funeral was small, just Marcus and a handful of people who'd known her. I sat beside him in that chapel and watched him finally break. Not the controlled, measured man I'd been pretending to love. Just a grieving boy who'd lost the last connection to his family. He wept against my shoulder, and I held him like I'd been holding him all along, for real, not for cameras or contracts or any reason except that I loved him and he was hurting. Afterward, in his penthouse, we sat in silence as the sun set over Manhattan. "The contract ends in 4 days," Marcus said finally. "After the gala, you'll be free of this. Free of me." His voice cracked on those last words, and I realized with devastating clarity that he thought he was setting me free, that he believed I wanted to escape. I almost told him then, almost said the words that would change everything. But my phone buzzed with another message from Richard Castellan, reminding me that in 96 hours, he would destroy everything Marcus had built unless I helped him. And I still didn't know how to choose between saving the man I loved and saving myself. The charity gala was everything Marcus had promised 3 months ago. Crystal chandeliers casting fractured light across marble floors. Women in gowns that cost more than cars. Men in tuxedos discussing mergers over champagne that tasted like liquid gold. The orchestra played something classical and forgettable while New York's elite pretended to care about causes they forget by morning. I wore the dress Marcus had bought me personally, not through Vivian but on his own. Midnight blue silk that moved like water. He'd left it in my apartment 2 days ago with a note in his precise handwriting for the final performance. "Thank you for everything." The formality of those words had broken something inside me. Marcus arrived to pick me up looking devastating in his tuxedo, his ice blue eyes traveling over me with an expression I couldn't read. "You look beautiful," he said quietly. "Not appropriate. Not suitable. Beautiful." It was the first genuine compliment he'd given me in weeks, and it felt like goodbye. The gala was our final act. Every touch, every smile, every carefully orchestrated moment of affection felt like a death. His hand on my waist as we moved through the crowd, my fingers adjusting his bow tie while cameras flashed. The way he pulled me close during the waltz, his breath warm against my ear as he whispered, "You've been extraordinary, Emma. I'll never forget what you've done for me." Then Richard Castellan appeared like a specter at a funeral. He pulled me aside while Marcus was speaking with board members. "Midnight," he said softly. "That's when I go public with everything, unless Marcus signs the sale agreement. You'll both be humiliated, but you'll keep your money." Quite the severance package for 3 months of lying. I found Marcus immediately, my heart hammering against my ribs. "We need to talk," I said. "Now." I told him everything. Richard's ultimatum, the midnight deadline, the choice between his company and our exposure. Marcus listened with that terrible stillness I'd learned meant he was calculating outcomes, measuring losses, preparing for disaster. "I won't sell," he said finally. "Let him expose us. I'll survive the scandal. The company might not, but I will. Emma," his voice dropped to something raw and broken, "I don't care about Thornfield Innovations anymore. I don't care about the board or the stock price or any of it. What do you care about?" I whispered. Marcus looked at me like a man standing at the edge of a cliff, deciding whether to jump. "You," he said. "I care about you. I've been in love with you for 2 months, Emma. This stopped being pretend the night you cried in the hospital. Every moment since then has been me trying not to fall deeper, while knowing it was already too late. The confession hung between us like something fragile and impossible. Outside the ballroom, Richard was waiting. In 2 hours, our world would explode. But for one perfect, terrible moment, the only thing that mattered was Marcus Thornfield finally telling me the truth. Richard didn't wait until midnight. He called an emergency board meeting right there at the gala, commandeering the hotel's executive conference room like he owned it. Board members filed in confused and irritated, their evening interrupted by whatever drama Richard had orchestrated. Marcus and I followed, his hand gripping mine so tightly I could feel his pulse racing against my palm. The conference room was all glass and polished mahogany, the kind of space designed for corporate warfare. Richard stood at the head of the table, like a prosecutor preparing for execution. "Gentlemen, ladies," he began, his voice smooth as poison. "I apologize for the disruption, but I've discovered something that requires immediate attention." He slid a manila envelope across the table toward the board chairman. "I have proof that Marcus Thornfield's engagement is fraudulent. A contract showing he paid this woman $100,000 to pose as his fiancée." The board erupted, voices overlapping in shock and outrage and betrayal. Marcus stood silent, his jaw clenched, every muscle in his body rigid with tension. I watched his entire world crumbling around him. Everything he'd built from nothing about to be destroyed by the truth we'd been hiding. "This is who you've trusted with your investments," Richard continued, warming to his performance. "A man who lies to your faces, who manufactures relationships for business advantage, who has no integrity, no honor, no respect for the values his company supposedly represents." I moved for an immediate vote of no confidence and Marcus's removal as CEO. The board chairman looked at Marcus with something like disappointment. "Is this true? Did you fabricate this engagement?" Marcus opened his mouth to respond, but I stood up before he could speak. The sound of my chair scraping against marble echoed through the sudden silence. "Yes," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "He hired me 3 months ago. $100,000 to pretend to be his fiancée, so you'd all believe he was stable enough to lead this company. Every photograph, every public appearance, every smile was part of the contract. Richard's right about that." Richard smiled triumphantly. Marcus looked at me like I'd just driven a knife between his ribs. But I wasn't finished. "Here's what that contract doesn't show," I continued. It doesn't show Marcus donating $500,000 anonymously to children's cancer research. It doesn't show him working 18-hour days to build a company that employs 3,000 people and change the technology industry. It doesn't show him visiting his dying grandmother in her final days or grieving at her funeral. It doesn't show the man who taught me that kindness isn't weakness and vulnerability isn't failure. I was paid to pretend to love him, but I'm standing here for free, telling you the truth. I do love him, not because of a contract or money or any business arrangement. I love Marcus Thornfield because he's the most honorable, decent, genuine man I've ever known. Fire him if you want. Humiliate us both. Destroy everything he's built. But you won't change what's real. You won't change the fact that somewhere between the lies and performance, we found something true. The boardroom fell silent. Richard's smile had vanished. Marcus stared at me with tears in his ice-blue eyes, and I knew that whatever happened next, I just gambled everything on the truth. The board chairman stood slowly, his weathered face unreadable. In 40 years of corporate leadership, he said, his voice carrying across the silent room, I've never witnessed such loyalty. Miss Mitchell, you've shown us something far more valuable than any fabricated relationship ever could. You've shown us the man Marcus Thornfield truly is. The kind of man who inspires this level of devotion, this kind of courage. That tells me everything I need to know about his character. He turned to Richard Castellan, whose face had gone pale. Mr. Castellan, your attempt to manipulate this board through blackmail and manufactured scandal has failed spectacularly. I suggest you leave before we discuss legal action for corporate espionage and extortion. Security will escort you out. Richard's protest died as 2 security guards appeared at his elbows. He shot Marcus one final look of pure hatred before being led from the room. The board members began filing out, several stopping to shake Marcus's hand or murmur words of support. Within minutes, we were alone in that glass conference room, the city glittering below us like we'd somehow conquered it together. You didn't have to do that, Marcus said quietly. You gave up everything. The money, your reputation, your safety. Emma, you destroyed yourself to save me. I turned to face him fully. I didn't give up anything, I whispered. I chose everything. There's a difference. Marcus reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box, the one I'd seen hidden in his drawer weeks ago. I bought this 6 weeks ago, he said, his voice rough with emotion, the night of the hospital charity event. When I watched you comfort that little girl and realized I was completely, irrevocably in love with you. I've been terrified to show you because I thought you'd run, that you'd think I was blurring the lines or manipulating you or breaking the rules we'd agreed to. He opened the box. The ring inside was nothing like the prop we'd used for photographs. This was delicate, personal, exactly the kind of thing I would have chosen for myself if I'd ever imagined being proposed to. Emma Mitchell, will you marry me? Not for a contract, not for show or appearances or business strategy, but because I cannot imagine my life without you. Because you've taught me that love is worth risking everything for. Yes, I said through tears. 1,000 times yes. Marcus slipped the ring onto my finger, and when he kissed me, it wasn't for cameras or contracts or any reason except that we loved each other. The most real thing either of us had ever felt. 1 year later, we were married in a small ceremony with just the people who truly mattered. Marcus's company thrived under his leadership. My art career finally took off with his support and encouragement, not because of his money, but because he believed in me when I'd stopped believing in myself. The photograph from that first gala still sits on his desk, a reminder that sometimes the greatest truth stars lies, and the best love stories begin with impossible choices. What started as the greatest deception of our lives became the truest thing we ever found. If this story moved you, if you believe that love can transform even the most broken hearts, I need you to do 3 things for me. First, subscribe to this channel so you never miss stories about love winning against impossible odds. Second, comment love wins below if you believe in second chances and the courage it takes to choose someone when everything tells you to walk away. And third, share this with someone who needs to believe in happy endings, who needs to know that vulnerability isn't weakness, and that real love is always worth fighting for. Scammers and cynics hate when good people win, but we know the truth. Love doesn't care how it starts. It only cares how it ends. Thank you for being here with me.